Carrie ruler. Sewn mitered corners on both sides of your quilt. First thing you do is cut the cloth that you're going to make into the binding. Because I'm making a 1/2 inch binding, I have cut this strip 2 1/4 inch wide. 1/2 inch twice on each side makes 2 inches, but you need this 1/4 of an inch so that you have some give for your batting in the fullness of the quilt. This is a piece of special template plastic. It is heat resistant. You can put an iron on this and nothing will happen. It doesn't bend, it doesn't crinkle. It's heat resistant. You can see that I cut this template plastic 1/2 inch wide. If we were making 3/8 inch binding, I would make this strip 3/8 inch wide. When you're making binding, they have you cut it and then fold it in half. You press it in half and then you sew this side to one side of your quilt, and then you're going to flip it over. The Carrie ruler is a little bit different in that we do not fold the binding in half. You want the 1/2 inch twice on each side, but you want that 1/4 of an inch in the middle for your fullness. I spray the fabric with water, and I have a fairly warm iron. I'm going to put this template right here and fold it. I push it down until I get it to come right up to the edge. Then I know I have a 1/2 inch because the template gives me 1/2 inch, and that's what I press. And I can press right over the template because the template is a heat resistant template. So then I make my edge 1/2 inch up. So I have doubled just like the other, only I have a 1/4 inch play in the middle. And then I just shift this down, press some more water on it, put the template in, and press it up. And now you have a 1/2 inch on this side. The next step is to pin it just like you would before when you ironed it in half. Now we've ironed down a 1/2 inch, and we're going to pin it to the quilt. With a Carrie ruler, because you're going to sew the mitered corners, you are going to you're going to give yourself an inch of extra material over the edge before you pin it down. I am pinning it, this is my start sew mark, a 1/2 inch from the edge. That's because I'm going to sew to a 1/2 inch on this end and stop, and I will start and stop at a 1/2 inch from this end because the two will meet into that mitered corner. You need that 1/2 inch square on the corner. I pin my binding to the quilt edge, and I have an extra inch over the edge, and I didn't start pinning, so I have my 1/2 inch. That's where I will start sewing. And then I just pin it like I would regular binding to the edge of the quilt. Now that I have my binding pinned on, I'm going to sew it on. I will use, because it's 1/2 inch binding, I will set my gauge for a 1/2 inch on my sewing machine, and I will sew 1/2 inch from the edge all the way down. I am sewing the binding to the edge of the quilt at 1/2 inch because I am putting on 1/2 inch binding. If I were putting on 3/8 of an inch binding, I would sew the binding 3/8 of an inch from the edge. This makes this binding a little bit different because I didn't sew 2 edges to the edge folded in half. I sewed 1, but I get a double thickness because I'm going to bring this up and it's going to cover that edge and it's going to flip to the back. So I have a double on this side and a double on that side. I like this because it gives me a little more, I'm not pulling quite so tight. It gives me a little more ease on the other side so that when I sew it down you don't see the stitching. It's easily covered by that because of that 1/4 inch give. Okay, let's look at the ruler because it's what's going to make my mitered corners. This ruler has 2. It has the 3/4 at the top and the 1/2 inch at the bottom. And it has 2 lines. One is for the 1/2 inch and one is for the 1/4. And then it has, of course, a ruler on the side. I've moved back to my ironing board. These are my two floppy corners, the 1 inch extra on each side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pair them together, edge to edge, straight line with the edge of the quilt and with the edge with each other, and then I'm just going to iron them so they stay there. I have a white marking pencil, and the reason I did white is because I'm working with this dark brown. If I'm not working with the dark brown, I often use just a mechanical pencil so that I just need to see the dots. There are two lines that we're going to use to line this up. This is the first one. It's the seam line, and that's the line that I sewed. And then there is the second line. See it right here? This is the other seam line, and that's the seam line that I sewed coming down the other one. So you have these two seam lines. That's what I'm going to use to line this up. I'm going to put this, and I'm using a 1/2 inch, not the 3/8. I'm going to go 1/2 inch here, and then I need to go on the seam line with the other one. So I have seam line and seam line. You'll see that red line comes on the edge of your fabric, the edge of your quilt. When I get those two lined up, then I'm going to mark these 4 dots. And then I'm going to use the edge of my Carrie ruler to connect the dots. Feel with your finger, you can feel that that line is going right along the fold line, that diagonal. And this one usually comes just above the edge. This one usually goes pretty close to the edge on those lines. Okay, this is the jig that I am going to now sew and then cut and turn. I'm going to go right here through that dot, and the dot should be pretty close to right where they meet. And then I am going to sew down that line. That's your sew line that you drew. And that's what I'm sewing down right now with small quilt stitches. Only I'm back stitching because I want it to be really tight, and I want it to be really straight, and I want it to look really good. So that's what I do. When you get to the point, as you know with all points, if you really want a point, you don't sew a point. You sew across a stitch across it. That's what makes a good point, is a flat stitch at the top. Okay, when you get to the very end, we're going to just put a stitch in that very end. And then so I don't see my thread, I can back up again. Now I'm going to cut this. I've sewn only the flap. I didn't sew the material itself, just the flap. And now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut just above that where I was. And then I'm going to cut, about 1/8 of an inch close to where I stitched. And I'm going to cut about 1/4 of an inch close to where I stitched. Now on this side I didn't stitch, but I'm going to cut down that line that I drew. And what this does, instead of cutting this off, is it gives me a fullness in that corner, which I want. I want that fullness there in the corner. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to turn this over to make my mitered corner. And I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to pull up the top, the edge, so I get that nice, notice that cross stitch gives me a nice point. I love that. So you see my sewn mitered corner? And I have it on both sides, so that's the beauty. You have a sewn mitered corner on both sides, and it fits exactly. There's no floppy floopy. It's right to your fabric because you've sewn it that way. And then you can take your edge, which will then cover the seam that you have sewn. We can pin that in place. Bring that other side over and we'll pin that down. So there you have your sewn mitered corner on both sides. If you're ever in a quilt contest, they will pick up your corners and they'll look. And if they see a sewn mitered corner, this is more impressive than just a loop corner, because you've got a perfect sewn mitered corner. You can machine stitch if you're good, and you can catch this, because this is a little longer. If you stitch in the ditch, you'll probably catch this, but I hate to chance that. So I usually hand stitch this with a blind stitch on the back side. When you buy a Carrie ruler, you get the Carrie ruler and the instructions for measuring and using it, and then you get a 1/2 inch and a 3/8 inch template plastic, the ones that are heat resistant for turning your edge up.